I'm rather amused by this phrase.
But then there's this fantastic part of this document where he literally reprimands Lee.
Well, it's quite dramatic, isn't it?
Well, from miniature, we can see that Mr. Lee here is sitting down. We did know from the diplomatic correspondence that he didn't sleep for 3 days because the next day, Singapore would be on its own.
It's a very accurate representation of what I remember watching on TV.
I think for a long time, the belief was that it was a unilateral decision taken by the Tunku, and leaders of Singapore were all caught by surprise. Now we know that it was a kind of a more nuanced and complicated process.
This letter, I found it during the pandemic. I was going through my dad's old files, and it said, "My dear Harry." I thought it was just one of his old friends, you know, and then you go further down and it says Harry Lee Kuan Yew. And then it's the 10th of August, 1965. So you realize about the separation. My dear Harry, why, I have kept asking myself of this since Sunday morning, when I was told of the decision to carve up Malaysia, and I was not even consulted about its break, merely presented with a fait accompli. I think I can claim to have worked for Malaysia as hard as anyone else. I'm getting emotional. Stop. My dad is Tun Fuad Stevens. In those days, he was Donald Stevens. He was the first Chief Minister of Sabah. This is a very personal letter. I think everybody's forgotten Lee Kuan Yew used to be named Harry, right? It was Harry and Donald. He would come to Sabah and they would go out for dinners and, you know, chat. Yeah.
So this letter was written by Donald Stevens directly to Lee Kuan Yew. And it was addressed to Lee Kuan Yew personally, not as a Prime Minister, but as a friend. Never in my wildest dream would I have believed that Harry Lee Kuan Yew was a quitter. And that is exactly what you have proved to be. So when I read this letter, the first thing that came to my mind was that this is a letter written by somebody who has been very, very hurt.
I feel like death, tears, heartbreak, and completely lost and betrayed. Years of hard work, uphill and down dale, selling the idea of Malaysia to my people. Blood, sweat, and tears, and success. Now this. Sabah and Sarawak were actually against coming into Greater Malaysia at the start, for a lot of reasons. Culturally, we're very different. Historically, we were not a majority Muslim states, right? We were Christian, all sorts, really. Malaya had more communal type politics, and there was rising Malay nationalism in West Malaysia, which was a bit of a worry for people who were non-Malays.
I remember speaking to a very close friend of Donald Stevens who told me that up to the very last moment, Donald Stevens said that Sabah did not want to join the Federation, but it was only after meeting privately with Lee Kuan Yew, he suddenly changed his mind.
As someone who is convinced that Malaysia must be made to work because it is the only way in which my country's way of life, my country's safety can be safeguarded for the future, I have done my best to make known as far as possible what Malaysia would entail among my people.
Lee Kuan Yew came and told them, okay, come on, let's do this. Then the attitudes had to change, I guess. Because the British were not that keen on giving Sabah and Sarawak independence on their own either. Lee Kuan Yew, his rallying cry was Malaysian Malaysia, which was something my father really felt strongly about as well. Multiracialism, meritocracy, all these values, rather than having everybody in communal boxes. Well, he says that, now I find that the friend, the idol, is made of cheap clay after all. I don't think they ever saw each other again. He was the friend who betrayed, Lee Kuan Yew started crying in the middle of a press interview, right? Because he felt very guilty about leaving so many people behind who believed in him.
So this was the press conference on 9th August that Mr. Lee called to announce Singapore's separation from Malaysia.
Could you outline for us the chain of events that led to this morning's proclamation?
Yes, I'm speaking partly from memory and partly from some notes which I made, which I...
Well, 1965, my father was director of broadcasting, and so I think my father must have been somewhere hovering around in the background, out of camera, probably around at the back somewhere.
It's interesting that he actually did this as a press conference. He could have just done one person standing in front of a television camera, but he chose a press conference with journalists sitting in front of him so that there was an engagement. Singapore had gained independence from British rule by being part of Malaysia, and now, just 2 years after, it has to leave Malaysia.
On this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish. I mean, for me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life,
I was only 11 years old. My father called home and told us to turn on the TV. I remember an atmosphere, indefined sense of foreboding of people around me.
you see, the whole of my adult life, I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories.
My father told me, and Mr. Lee wrote in his memoirs, my father advised him not to cut that scene. I can guess why. It shows the critical time it was, that even Mr. Lee broke down.
Would you mind if we stop for a while?
I don't think it hurt him. May have helped him because it showed Singaporeans that this was a desperate time, to the extent that even Mr. Lee broke down. It's something that could have helped rally people.
I think for a long time, the belief was that it was a unilateral decision taken by the Tunku and that leaders of Singapore were all caught by surprise. And therefore, his reaction was that of a shock and a major disappointment. Now we know that it's a more nuanced and complicated process, a negotiated separation.
It was a slow narrowing of options because of the fundamental incompatibility of two ideas of how we should be governed, what kind of society we should be.
Lee Kuan Yew wanted a multiracial Malaysia, a Malaysian Malaysia, whereas Tunku wanted to preserve Malay special privileges.
So the Malaysians wanted out and Singapore wanted out.
But Sabah and Sarawak, nobody consulted them about Singapore's exits.
Separation was kept out from them because in any negotiation on such a big matter, I mean, you wouldn't want any leakage. The fewer people who know, the more successful it's likely to be, right?
This file collection of documents is entitled The Withdrawal of Singapore from Malaysia, August 1965. Now, these are the original documents that were actually seen and passed around by British officials in the immediate aftermath of the separation of Singapore. And the first document in this file, which comes right at the bottom of the stack, is the letter from Lord Head. He was High Commissioner to Malaysia. On the 8th of August 1965, he writes in a panic to Whitehall when he suddenly found out what's going on. And then everything else is the drama, the diplomatic drama of what follows. So many of these documents reveal just how blindsided the British were by the whole event of separation. And what we get is this massive correspondence, a flurry of communications, telegrams, confidential reports. They reveal a very frantic language. They're trying to make sense of the situation. They're trying to come up with their response, how they're going to present this in public.
Whenever these telegrams are dispatched or sent, it is all according to UK time. So the first is dispatched at 6 p.m, 8th of August, 1965. So really looking at the early hours in Singapore or in KL. On the 9th of August, there's another 23:35, 8th of August. Just after midnight, 0055, 9th of August. And again, 9th of August, 0400 hours. 0540, 9th of August. 7:15, the 9th of August. They're fairly hastily composed, and it really gives you a sense of the urgency on the ground and the fact that the British had not been kept in the loop with these major events.
If you look at the British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson's published diaries, it is seen as such a disaster, this split, that Harold actually comes back from his holiday early and, sort of bangs heads together in Whitehall, sort of saying, what are we going to do? It's one of those sort of moments where it just throws Britain. The whole regional strategy, if you like, has fallen apart.
Of all these documents, there are two that I'd like to really highlight. Both take place on the 9th of August. So one is a telegram from Kuan Yew to Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister. By the time you have decoded this message, you will know that the Tunku has proclaimed, and I have agreed and simultaneously also proclaimed, Singapore as a separate and sovereign nation. There is this mention of, it is ironic that because of your personal concern for me and my colleagues and what we represent, such an unfortunate result has ensued. Lee is pointing to the fact that he and the PAP were seen as being friendly and receptive towards the British. His willingness to work and his friendship towards Britain had caused tensions within Malaysia and perhaps the Tunku and political camp that were less receptive to the British.
What is very clear is the Tunku and certainly UMNO politicians of the time believed that Lee Kuan Yew is preferred by the British. There is this paranoia that he's far more at ease with them. He does seem to have some kind of rapport that the Tunku doesn't have, and that creates tension. There is this sense that even with separation, are the British going to be equal in treating us both, or are they going to lean towards Singapore?
There's an additional letter on the 9th of August. This is sent by Mr. Mills, who was the Deputy High Commissioner based in Singapore. And he's speaking about Lee. He asked me particularly to say to Mr. Wilson that he was sorry that he had not been able to let them know in advance of what had been decided. He knew that if we had been told, we would have done everything we could to stop it. But he believed that the Malays were set on having their little Malay kingdom at all costs, and that we would not have been able to prevent bloodshed. Lee continues, he said frankly that he knew he was dependent on the United Kingdom, Australia and New Zealand, and without the bases he was finished.
As soon as the deed was done, as soon as separation had been effected, Mr. Lee, he knew that he would still need to depend on British support, especially in security terms.
This is a letter sent from the Deputy High Commissioner, Mills, to Malaysia. So this is the day the separation of Singapore was announced. So the timing of this letter would have been at least 12 hours would have passed. Okay, paragraph 2. Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who was in emotional and exhausted state. He had not slept for 3 days. We had the TV footage of him, breaking down and needing a few moments to compose himself. To see it repeated in a letter, personally, it reinforces what a difficult time Lee Kuan Yew was not only dealing with Tunku and KL counterparts, he also had to manage his cabinet colleagues because not all of them agreed to separation.
Well, many in Singapore today think the separation agreement was signed without any trouble. But in fact, the truth of the matter, as various dispatches showed from classified files, which are now declassified, is that particularly Dr. Toh and Rajaratnam, they refused to sign the separation agreement. This was the runway of the Paya Lebar International Airport, and this would be where Mr. Rajaratnam on 10th of August would step onto the soil of independent Singapore for the first time. You could see in his face, he was dog-tired, hardly slept a wink, probably the previous night. And he was fresh from the trauma of separation, but still having to appear composed and totally confident as he met reporters clamoring for his views. He made his first public remarks on foreign policy in this very building. So when you read the letter from the Deputy High Commissioner from Singapore to the Commonwealth Relations Office on 10th of August, I had a long talk with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Lee told me he was still worried about solidarity of PAP cabinet, particularly Toh and Rajaratnam. They and other ministers whose homes were in Malaya had been brought to sign the separation agreement only by great efforts. And not only did Lee Kuan Yew face the prospect that Toh and Rajaratnam might rebel, but there's also the possibility that he might lose them as potential ministers. On 7th of August, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew made an urgent call separately to Dr. Toh and Mr. Rajaratnam, asking them both to come up to Kuala Lumpur for an urgent secret meeting, but to come separately, because he didn't want both of them to get together and to collude and to take a position that's hardened. And so Mr. Rajaratnam rushed up and Dr. Toh rushed up separately. And separately, they were greeted by Mr. Lee, who told them the most shocking news. I mean, it's beyond their wildest expectation. In fact, it was like a nightmare because they had fought so hard, number one, for merger, and number two, they had also played such a major driving role in the formation of the Malaysian Solidarity Convention, where they were championing a Malaysian Malaysia.
So, PM was in a very agitated frame of mind. He told us, well, it has come to this, reached the end of the road. These are Tunku's proposal. As far as I was concerned, I was very upset. And then I first refused to accept. And Dr. Toh was equally adamant.
So they refused to sign the separation agreement.
And if they don't sign, then Lee already said he will not go through with it.
Well, they wanted to see the Tunku. The Tunku says, no, I will not see them, my decision is final. They both still refused to accept it. So Mr. Lee went back to Tunku and said, can you write a letter? Maybe with your letter, they can be persuaded. I've got the letter from Tunku to Dr. Toh. My dear Chin Chai, I'm writing to tell you that I have given the matter of our break with Singapore my utmost consideration, and I find that in the interest of our friendship and the security and peace of Malaysia as a whole, there is absolutely no other way out. I request you most earnestly to agree. Kind regards. Both Dr. Toh Chin Chai and Mr. Rajaratnam took hours after reading Tunku's letter to mull over it. So Dr. Toh was sitting on the table, writing on a piece of paper with a pen, the pros and cons. Rajaratnam also took hours stubbing out cigarette after cigarette. He was a chain smoker, puffing and puffing. And then deciding at the end, we still would not sign the separation agreement. And in the end, Mr. Lee told them, look, if you want to carry on, you carry on, but you accept the responsibility for a bloodbath. Dr. Toh, you can be PM, I can be your DPM. If blood flows, you have to take responsibility for it. And that sobered them up. Dr. Toh had no desire to be Prime Minister. So Dr. Toh signed the separation agreement first. Mr. Rajaratnam was the most unwilling to sign. But he did it. But when he did it, it was like signing away all that he had fought for. It was signing away his dreams for a Malaysian Malaysia.
Telah berkumpul dalam satu apel besar yang saya perintahkan beberapa hari yang lalu untuk menerima langsung dari saya Komando Aksi Pengganyangan Malaysia.
After the separations between Singapore and Malaysia, there's one particular country that was happy at the turnout of events. This report, dated 9th of August 1965, is the conversations between a British diplomat with an Indonesian diplomat named Ganesh Halsono. Quote, I have just had 45 minutes with Ganesh Halsono. He found it hard to conceal his glee at the latest turns of events. And this is quite important here. Indonesia has always said that Malaysia was not a viable entity, and this was now proved. Indonesia could say to the United Nations, I told you so. From the Jakarta perspective, Malaysia as a political entity designed and formed by the imperialist British do not have the right to exist.
As far as President Sukarno is concerned, the Malaysia scheme is a neo-colonial plot. And so when merger takes place, almost immediately, Indonesia announces an official policy of confrontasi. This is an undeclared war.
And Indonesia strikes against her neighbor, sending paratroopers on guerrilla missions, waging a deliberate, undeclared war of terror and aggression.
The Indonesians were concerned that the British military bases in Malaysia and Singapore could be used against Indonesian interests.
For a long time, Singapore actually has had massive trade with the Dutch East Indies as it once was, and now Indonesia. A lot of it's actually on a barter basis. And so when Indonesia announces an official policy of confrontasi, there is a sort of economic boycott, if you like, by Indonesia of the Malaysia territories, which creates huge problems for Singapore.
That ban actually had an impact on the Singapore maritime industry, the transportation industry, and the employment level. At the point of independence, Singapore was desperate to build up its economy, so we wanted to conduct the barter trade with Indonesia. This is Pulau Senang behind me. The Singapore government proposed for this area to be where the barter trade will have taken place.
The barter trade proposal created a lot of angst from the Malaysians. Like, if Singapore is going to make Pulau Senang a location to have a barter trade with Indonesia, then you're almost opening a backdoor for Malaysia's nemesis to go through, which is something that the Malaysian government is not very happy, right?
After the separation, Lee Kuan Yew says, we're going to do barter trade with Indonesians, and the Malaysians say, we'll walk in, we'll take military force, because this is a direct threat against Malaysia.
We have archival documents from the Australian archive. One of the documents dated 16th of August. It says here that from external camera, now which means that the cablegram is from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Australia. And this document was sent to the office of the High Commissioner for Australia in London. It was mentioned that Tunku and Razak have told Commonwealth representatives that Malaysia will take action, i.e. military occupation of Singapore, if Singapore accepted an Indonesian consulate or embassy, or try any funny business with China or Indonesia. I was quite surprised when I first saw this document. The fact that Malaysia indicated that it was willing to take military action against Singapore, I would say a wow in the history of Singapore defense policy. Singapore at that point in time was defenseless. We have a small armed forces, 2 infantry battalions, but most of them were actually Malaysians. According to archival documents, while Malaysians was opposing Singapore barter trade with Indonesia, Dr. Goh Keng Swee was very smart. He did some check. And it was revealed Malaysians were actually conducting their own barter trade with Indonesia. So we see a double standard here from the Singapore perspective. You can do something with Indonesia, but Singapore can't do the same thing.
So it did seem for some months after the 9th of August that relations were continuing to go downhill. The barter trade issue only made Singapore more determined to build up the Singapore armed forces. Singapore really has to stand on its own 2 feet, militarily and also economically.
On the 23rd of August, there is a really interesting exchange that takes place between Lee Kuan Yew and Prime Minister Harold Wilson. I'll start by reading the text of the message from Lee Kuan Yew to the Prime Minister. I read in today's newspaper that the Tories blame you, Bottomley, and the Labour Party for taking things too easy in January this year, leading to this tragic break.
You have your own troubles with your opposition party with an election possible next year. If it is any help, I can show that it was a Tory former Defence Minister, Lord Head in Kuala Lumpur, who was complacent in January, February and March this year.
He, like other Tory ministers, thought they could browbeat little Democrat socialists in Singapore in the same way as they browbeat feudal princelings in Kuala Lumpur.
Little Democrat socialists in Singapore, so that's the PAP that he's referring to. And then browbeating feudal princelings. He's thinking about the Tunku.
So Lord Head is a very interesting figure who hasn't really featured as much as he should, really, in the story of separation.
He was the man on the spot, the British High Commissioner in Kuala Lumpur. He had a long career in service of the British government.
He's a Conservative politician in the past, but the interesting thing is he's serving as High Commissioner when the government has become Labour within Britain. I think in some ways Lord Head represents to Lee a kind of conservative, patriarchal figure. He's an easy target. So what Lee's doing in this document is he's offering dirt on Lord Head to help the British Prime Minister in a potential re-election against his Tory rivals.
Given that this is only 2 weeks since independence, Lee would have been extremely busy, and yet he's also reading the papers for British domestic. politics. And he's saying, how can I help? He's trying to ally himself with Wilson and see, can he make use of his knowledge of the British political system and domestic scene to Singapore's advantage.
I mean, if you're a small country, you cannot take your relevance for granted. All right? So you have to create relevance to the government in power in Britain.
The response that he gets from Wilson is fascinating. Harold Wilson writes, "I well understand the great strains and pressure under which you have been working over the past weeks." He's almost making out that Lee's writing this way because he's under tremendous pressure, maybe not completely in his full capacities mentally. But then there's this fantastic part of this document where he literally reprimands Lee. "I was, however, distressed by your remarks about Lord Head and our officials in the High Commissions in Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. I am quite satisfied that your fears do not have any basis in fact."
Our High Commissioners and their staff have throughout been operating and will continue to operate on my instructions. They have our full confidence, and I would ask you to give them yours.
So I think Wilson is trying to draw a line there with, these are my representatives, my relationship with them is something that I can watch. Leave the domestic to us.
Just shows that Lee Kuan Yew kind of misreads, I think, the situation.
We would also not want anybody to get involved in our politics, but I think it was a desperate time. He needed support, he needed help.
In the immediate few days after separation, Lee Kuan Yew was advised by the person in charge of his security that there could be indeed various possible threats against himself. This is from the British government representative to the Commonwealth Relations Office, and this concerns a clandestine communist organization whose operatives planned the assassination of Singapore government officials. Police issued a statement on 26 August giving history of plot by a clandestine communist organization calling itself People's Revolutionary Party of Singapore, whose aim was to establish a communist state in Singapore through armed rebellion. So the PRPS plans are said to have included, firstly, assassination of Singapore ministers and certain members of the police force. If there was a main target, my guess is that it would probably have been Lee Kuan Yew.
If you target the head of the snake, you remove it, it will cause Singapore to be destabilized. I think that is the main objective of this plot.
It's hard for us to envisage a situation, but back then, the entire enterprise of what we now call Singapore could be taken down or taken out by assassinating. That would have been curtains for Singapore. In the immediate few days after separation, Lee Kuan Yew was advised by the person in charge of his security that the situation was not exactly stable. There were various threats against himself. And instead of moving to his Oxley Road house, he moved to Changi Cottage with his wife. It was right next to a Royal Air Force base, so it was in a protected and secure area. And that was important. His children needed continued schooling, so they remained in the Oxley Road house even while it was being secured.
This is one of the rooms of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew house along Oxley Road. It's a very simple layout, nothing extravagant. It is a civilian house. In the security line, we call it a soft target. It means that it's not a military facilities. It is not designed to withstand any attack on it. So here we see the steel plate was installed to protect the house while the bulletproof glass were being manufactured.
Police had been aware for some time of the existence of this clandestine communist organization. They now say with their latest operation on 26 August, they successfully smashed the cell and arrested 20 members of the organization. It claimed that these were Chinese communist volunteers who had fled to Jakarta in 1963.
China had turned communist in 1949. In Southeast Asia, there was always the belief that if the states were not supported by British security umbrella or American friendship and economic support, they would all turn communist. So there was the same concern they had for Singapore.
Communists, of course, wanted to bring about the downfall of all colonial powers and to set up a communist state in Malaysia and Singapore. It is possible that the puppet masters behind this particular cell did indeed feel that the post-9th August period was probably the right time to strike. It's difficult with the passage of time now to divine what must have been going through Lee Kuan Yew's minds in those few weeks since separation. There's a lot of things on his mind. Meeting senior civil servants and also explaining what does it mean for government's relations to civil service, and there's also the issue of personal safety. These were some of the preoccupations. But he also needs to move and rouse the people.
If Cuba, with an American base, with American sovereignty, is independent and not a new colonialist stooge, then the people of Singapore, owners of the British bases. I mean, I could give you a notice, 24 hours notice, you have to quit. Or you are committing an act of aggression with very serious consequences.
So this is an interview that Lee Kuan Yew gave to foreign journalists a few weeks after the separation of Singapore from Malaysia. He's really trying to make it very clear what his stance is, particularly regarding the British military bases.
I think, Mr. Lee, you know as many English phrases as I do.
No, I'm quite sure it's not possible.
I'm
because,
quite sure, but there is
I
one.
spend so much time talking other languages,
Yes,
so you speak only
is
one.
One very good English saying.
Yeah.
You can't have the bun and the penny too.
Yeah.
Now, I would rather that you made it a little clearer.
Yeah.
When you say you'll do as you wish with the bases.
No,
Why not
no,
say
I
what
never
there?
said that. No, you're putting words into my mouth. I said, you cannot do as you wish with the basis without consulting me. That is what I said. Not I will do what I wish.
On the surface, it's quite surprising what Lee Kuan Yew seems to be saying. I can tell you, British troops, to quit, and you have to get rid of yourselves and your bases. It's interesting, but does he mean it?
This interview really had impact because you begin to see discussions of it appearing in classified documents, particularly critiquing Lee's comments and his tone in that interview. This document was written by Singapore's High Commissioner, J.V. Robb. So Robb says, there was some inspired press comment here over the weekend which suggested that one of Lee's motives was to improve his bargaining position over the bases with the British government. I think this may well have been his intention. He aimed to make it plain that while we had no alternative but to remain here because our allies could not replace us, and none of us dared let Singapore and Southeast Asia go to the communists, Indonesia, he implied that if we try to play our only strong card, withdrawal, he would take it to be bluff.
I would put it this way. Lee Kuan Yew running around trying to get the business of state done, trying to get recognition from the international community of nations. He realizes that there is this danger of Singapore being seen as an imperialist lackey or stooge. I think he's very calculated when he does this. He says to reporters, I can give you notice and you have to quit, you know? It's not meant as a threat to anybody, but is it meant to show the wider international community that actually there may be bases in this country, but we're no one's stooge?
However, it looks as if he has for once miscalculated the amount of understanding he would get in Britain and weakened his bargaining position by inducing a state of mind in the British press and public opinion which questions whether we are right to stay here at all.
There is some sense that, okay, maybe he has sort of overplayed his hand on this particular issue.
He makes a point of saying, you need to seek permission from me if you want to do anything with the bases. This is really interesting and quite a strong line in terms of saying to the British that they need permission. It's also rather ironic because what we know from documents is that for many years the British had actually been doing as they pleased with the bases without feeling the need to consult any local leaders or authorities.
So we're now at the RAF Museum in Hendon in North London, and this plane is an Avro Vulcan bomber. Together with the Victor and the Valiant, it formed the V-bombers. It was the main British nuclear deterrent through most of the Middle Cold War, between 1959 and the late 1960s. These planes flew mainly from air bases in the UK, but what people don't realise is there was also being sent overseas to the Far East, the bases in Singapore. These are documents from the National Archives in London, top secret documents about nuclear weapons being deployed in Singapore.
Gosh, this is so interesting. Generally, this is all about the plans to use Singapore as a nuclear base and the actual housing of armaments. Goodness. Which so few people know anything about.
The first one is from the Air Council. It's a note by the Vice Chief of Air Staff, and they're basically saying they need to use nuclear weapons to match China's manpower. Britain had been a global power for nearly 300 years, and to be able to maintain that position, it needed to show itself playing a role in containing communism in Asia. And Singapore was really central to that. It couldn't do it without the base at Singapore. And so it came to see Singapore as being essential, to be seen as playing a role alongside the Americans containing China in the region.
So there was a 1958 document, 22nd March, in which it was stated that if we are to retain our position in the Far East, it is essential that V-bombers able to carry nuclear bombs should be capable of operating from Tengah Air Base, Singapore. No other airfield in the area would satisfy this requirement.
And the final document, this is perhaps the most interesting one. This is from July 1963. So at a time when Malaysia is being formed, facing opposition from Sukarno of confrontation. It's a top secret document, especially restricted circulation. It's the Chiefs of Staff Committee, the highest level decision-making body for the British military and armed forces. It shows that the plans have been put into effect.
This document then says quite categorically that the nuclear weapons were already available in Singapore.
I didn't actually know they were setting up Tengah Airfield as a nuclear bomber arsenal. And what is really interesting is the extent to which the Tunku was kept out of the picture.
Because the British knew that the presence of nuclear weapons would have been very sensitive, and they kept it a secret from the local leaders.
It's talking about training their crews on the ground to be able to arm up planes with nuclear weapons. They are worried if they do this to open the Singapore public or authorities or journalists might become aware of what's going on. Quite deviously, Edward Peck, the Foreign Affairs official, says if that happens, we could show them dummy weapons and imply it was just training using dummy nuclear weapons, not real warheads.
If pressed on the presence of live weapons, we should offer no comment.
Once separation took place, the British were horrified by separation. They were taken by surprise. And their big fear is now Singapore's going to be independent by itself. And even if Kuan Yew is willing to keep the base, maybe even keep a nuclear role, he wouldn't stay in power forever. And there might be more left-wing governments who would start place restrictions on the base and may even ask for removal. They just felt it was just more insecure. They felt they couldn't rely on having the base for 5 years or 10 years. So in 1965, when Singapore leaves Malaysia, the British then at that point want to pull out. They don't care anymore.
So much of history is presented through documents which have in a way been through a kind of a filter. You get public speeches, you get official documents carefully formulated to record events. Here you get these telegrams, confidential correspondences, which are all without that filter. So it reacquaints you with just how contingent and anxious and how sometimes potentially violent these kind of major political upheavals were.
I think the declassified letters is striking. I'm just looking at this letter now. We're able to impute different views and motives on the minds of the key players.
These letters provide a different perspective and add layers to the whole period between merger and separation. I mean, it's an incredible political narrative. If you are a Hollywood producer trying to do a political drama, you couldn't come up with a better script.